On August 17, 1987, Rudolf Hess, former deputy Fuehrer to Adolf Hitler, was found dead from asphyxiation in a reading room on the grounds of Spandau, where he had been serving a life sentence since 1947.
After Germany's defeat in World War II, Spandau became home to all the high-ranking Nazis who were sentenced at the Nuremberg trials. Hess outlived them all, even the ones who completed shorter sentences or were released for health reasons. At the time of his death, Hess had been the only prisoner at Spandau for over 20 years.
Prison officials allegedly found an electrical cord strung around a window latch and tied to Hess's neck. In a joint statement issued by the US, UK, Soviet Union, and France, his death was ruled a suicide.
But did Hess really commit suicide? Many people, including his own son, believe he was actually murdered by the British Secret Intelligence Service. Others believe it wasn't actually Rudolf Hess who served out that life sentence in Spandau at all. Conspiracy? Maybe. Coincidence? Maybe. Complicated.
Absolutely. Today, we'll tell the official story of the life and death of Rudolf Hess, the deputy Fuhrer in Adolf Hitler's Germany. As far as Rudolf Hess is remembered, it's for his 1941 peace-seeking mission to Scotland, a solo flight he allegedly attempted without the permission of his boss, Adolf Hitler. As soon as he touched down in Scotland, he was arrested as a prisoner of war. He spent the rest of his life in prison for his war crimes.
That's the official story, at least.
But to understand what led Hess to that infamous flight to Scotland, we have to understand his life from the beginning. Rudolf Hess was born in 1894 in Alexandria, Egypt, to German parents who owned a successful export business. His father, Fritz, hoped Rudolf would someday take over the venture. The family lived in a villa on the Mediterranean coast and frequently visited their summer home in Germany.
When he grew up, Hess went to Switzerland to study business. After a year, he decided not to come back to Egypt and join the family enterprise. Instead, he enlisted in the German army at the outbreak of World War I in 1914.
Hess excelled as an infantryman and was awarded the Iron Cross, second class, for bravery in action. Eventually, a serious chest wound caused him to be declared unfit for infantry service. However, Hess was not ready to give up his military career.
Hess enrolled to be trained as a pilot in the Imperial Flying Corps. He reached the rank of lieutenant before being relieved of duty in December 1918, shortly after the war ended. He never saw action as an aviator in World War I, but the skill he developed as a pilot would prove crucial later in his life.
After Germany's humiliating defeat in World War I, the nation was in turmoil. Germany's considerable financial obligations to the victorious Allies, along with a nosedive in the value of its currency, fed the growing political instability. Left and right-wing groups were battling for control of Germany, often through bloody street violence.
Searching for a way to occupy himself in Germany's ruined economy, Hess enrolled as a student at the University of Munich. He developed a close relationship with one of his instructors, Professor Karl Haushofer, who is considered to have fathered the field of geopolitics, or the study of geography's effect on politics and international relations.
Haushofer promoted a doctrine known as Lebensraum, or living space, which espoused the idea that Germany's struggle was due to the need for more territory and natural resources. Lebensraum would later be used to justify Germany's invasion of its neighbors.
Haushofer had a profound influence on Hess and is widely considered to be instrumental in Hess's involvement in politics. In 1920, at 26 years old, Hess entered a Munich beer hall and attended his first meeting of the still brand new National Socialist German Workers, or Nazi Party.
It sure is strange to imagine the Nazi Party as a grassroots movement meeting in a beer hall.
Absolutely, but it wouldn't be a grassroots movement for very long. Its rising star was none other than 31-year-old Adolf Hitler, the party's 7th member. Hess joined on July 1st, 1920, becoming the party's 16th member. Like so many others, Hess was spellbound by Hitler's energy and charisma, and became a vocal advocate for both the party's doctrines and for Hitler himself.
Within a year, Hess had become one of Hitler's closest confidants. He assumed the role of recruiting students into the Sturmabteilung, or SA, the party's own paramilitary organization. The SA, which claimed several million members at its peak, was the predecessor to the even more brutal Schutzstaffel, or SS, in which Hess also held a senior position.
Things started to get serious in 1923, when Hess and Hitler led about 2,000 SA members in a march on Munich's city center. It was an attempt to forcefully overthrow the Bavarian state government and, by extension, they hoped, the entire national regime.
The attempt failed, but 4 police officers and 60 Nazi Party members were killed in the ensuing gun battle.
That move got Hess and Hitler both thrown into Landsberg prison. Luckily for them, the prison was run by Nazi sympathizers who made their stay comfortable, even allowing Hess visits from his old professor, Karl Haushofer. During their time at Landsberg, Hess and Hitler collaborated on Hitler's infamous memoir, Mein Kampf.
Most people know that Mein Kampf contains messages of violent anti-Semitism, but lesser known is the fact that it also portrays cooperation with Britain as key to Germany's survival and success. This fact would become instrumental in Hess's political decisions moving forward.
Both men were released from Landsberg on parole in December 1924, and Hess soon became Hitler's personal secretary. For the next several years, he served Hitler unquestioningly and without public recognition, as the Nazi Party relentlessly campaigned for support.
Meanwhile, Hess continued to pursue his interest in aviation. When Charles Lindbergh won fame as the first person to fly non-stop across the Atlantic in 1927, Hess's resolve to become a renowned aviator was permanently galvanized. By crossing the Atlantic in the opposite direction as Lindbergh, from east to west, against the prevailing winds, Hess hoped he could outdo the celebrated American pilot.
Hess committed himself to that goal for almost a year, even soliciting industrial sponsorship for his trip. Unfortunately for Hess, he was never able to get enough money together to attempt the flight.
But Hess never lost his passion for flying, even after he got married. Hess's wedding to Ilse Prohl took place in December 1927, with both Karl Haushofer and Adolf Hitler acting as witnesses.
Hess was a devoted family man, and he worked hard to insulate his wife from politics. She was only seen with him in public during social occasions, such as concerts and theater performances.
And unlike the majority of top Nazi leaders, Hess didn't use his authority to accumulate huge amounts of wealth. He lived with his family in a relatively modest house in Munich, and the only conspicuous purchase he made was a nice Mercedes, which he loved to drive fast.
Well, that need for speed didn't stop on the ground. Hess acquired his first aircraft in the summer of 1930, a BFW M23B. It was given to him by Völkischer Beobachter, the Nazi Party newspaper. The paper had its name painted on the fuselage, and as a way of combining his passion for flying with his passion for politics, Hess would do low-altitude flybys to disrupt rival political meetings.
In one particularly obnoxious incident, Hess circled above an outdoor meeting of the leftist Republican Party for 2 hours, drowning out the speaker. He was issued a summons by the police for that one.
As a result of the elections that same year, the Nazi Party became the number 2 party in the Reichstag, the national legislative body. 2 years later, Hitler made Hess political central commissioner of the party and delegate to the Reichstag.
By this time, the relationship between Hess and Hitler was so strong that Hess was positioned to become the second most powerful man in Germany once the Nazi Party finally took over the country.
That happened fairly quickly. Hitler became chancellor in January 1933, And just 4 months later, he appointed Hess deputy chancellor with an unambiguous decree that read, quote, "I appoint party member Rudolf Hess to be my deputy and bestow on him plenary powers to take decisions in my name on all matters affecting the leadership of the party," end quote. By the way, plenary power means absolute power with no checks.
Which is exactly the type of power the Reichstag gave Hitler 2 months later. The Enabling Act of 1933 allowed Hitler to enact any law he wanted without approval from the legislature.
That kind of power can never lead anywhere good.
We'll explore Hess's journey into the outbreak of World War II and the events that led to his decision to undertake his fateful peace mission to Scotland without Hitler's permission. Just 7 months after the Enabling Act gave Hitler unilateral legislative power over Germany, Hitler gave his deputy, Rudolf Hess, even more power as well. Hess was put in charge of the departments of press, reconstruction, finance, law, Germans living abroad, education, building, technical matters, health, race, art and literature, and, not insignificantly, foreign affairs.
Sounds like Hitler thought pretty highly of this guy.
That would be an understatement. Hitler referred to Hess as his closest advisor, and according to the British ambassador to Germany, Sir Neville Henderson, Hitler seemed to regard Hess as his adopted son.
In April 1933, Hess helped implement a nationwide boycott of Jewish businesses, marking the beginning of the Nazi regime's systematic persecution of Jewish people. Hess is considered to have had a less extreme attitude toward Jewish people than Hitler did, but he certainly didn't make any serious attempt to stop Hitler's anti-Semitic activities.
Definitely not. However, Hess's mentor from the University of Munich, Karl Haushofer, married a half-Jewish woman, which meant their 2 sons, Albrecht and Heinz, were 1/4 Jewish. Hess protected them by issuing letters exempting the Haushofer family from anti-Semitic laws.
At the same time, Hess's office helped draft the Nuremberg Laws, which prohibited marriage between Jewish and Aryan Germans and deprived Jewish Germans of their citizenship rights.
That makes it even more strange that Hess not only helped the Jewish Albrecht Haushofer escape persecution, but the 2 men were actually close friends. Albrecht, a well-traveled academic who was very critical of the Nazi Party, became Hess's most trusted advisor on Britain.
Albrecht and Hess's complicated friendship probably got even more complicated in August 1934, when the president of Germany died and left Hitler as his successor.
During the Nuremberg rally that year, which was the Nazi Party's annual propaganda event, Hess famously shouted to the massive crowd, quote, "The party is Hitler, but Hitler is Germany and Germany is also Hitler. Heil Hitler, Sieg Heil," unquote.
If the man had a sense of nuance, he sure knew how to turn it off.
You can say that again. By this time, Germany was on a hopeless slide into full dictatorship, and Hess was leading the charge.
Hess was a prolific public speaker, constantly speaking at rallies, even having many of his speeches published. He spoke in the same spirited way that Hitler did, and always on the same general topics: rebuilding the German military, the importance of absolute loyalty to Hitler and the party, and the danger posed by communists and Jewish people.
As involved in politics as Hess was during the Nazi regime, his passion for aviation was never neglected. In 1934, Hess won Germany's first national air race, which took a perilous route around Zugspitze Mountain, the highest peak in Germany. He was incredibly proud of this.
But after this victory, Hitler decided that flying around giant mountains was too dangerous an activity for someone so important, and he forbade Hess from flying.
This was the first crack in Hess's loyalty to Hitler.
Despite Hitler's orders, Hess entered the same race the following year and placed 6th out of 29. He also won a prize from BFW, the manufacturer of his aircraft, recognizing him for a notable achievement in one of their company's planes.
In 1936, Hess performed some death-defying aerobatics in a Messerschmitt Bf 108 Typhoon, not knowing that doing so was prohibited in that model, since it had a propensity to crash during such complicated maneuvers.
In the same year Hess accidentally stunt flew the Messerschmitt, Hitler joined Italian dictator Benito Mussolini in creating the Axis of Germany and Italy, and signed an anti-communist agreement with Japan.
As Germany descended deeper into the throes of brutal anti-Semitism, armed conflict with other European powers started to seem inevitable.
Hitler's policies were becoming more and more extreme, and the world was taking notice. This period saw the birth of the SS, a new paramilitary organization that used intimidation and murder to enforce the Fuhrer's policies. Hess was made a general in the SS, put in charge of what was essentially a group of terrorists.
On the night of November 9th, 1938, riotous violence erupted across Germany. The police, on orders from Hitler, arrested and beat Jewish citizens while their homes and businesses were ransacked and torched. The evening would eventually be known as the Night of the Broken Glass because of the large number of broken windows lining the streets.
Hess, whom we mentioned was not as extreme of an anti-Semite as Hitler, was upset by the riots and ordered all the provincial governors to immediately stop the anti-Jewish riots. He also asked Hitler to end the, quote, demonstrations.
Once again, Hess was hardly a strong advocate for Jewish Germans, but the man best known for his devotion to Hitler was showing some signs of disloyalty.
It is surprising to hear that a top Nazi leader asked Hitler to dial it back. I wonder if he was experiencing a sense of split loyalty between Hitler and the Haushofer family.
As much as Hess admired Hitler, he had to have had a soft spot for the family of the mentor who exposed him to his political ideology in the first place.
By this time, Germany had garnered an international reputation for being hateful and uncivilized. But inside Germany, Hess was enjoying his personal peak. He was extremely popular amongst the German public because of his complete and steadfast loyalty to Hitler. He was held up as a model citizen that all Germans should emulate. He loved the fame.
But the days of Hess's limelight bliss were numbered. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. The United Kingdom issued an ultimatum demanding that Germany withdraw its troops, or the British would join the war on behalf of its ally.
Hitler refused the ultimatum on the morning of September 3rd. The UK, France, Australia, and New Zealand declared war on Germany, and the Second World War began.
It wasn't long before Hess and Hitler's relationship started to erode. In Hitler's address to the nation on the day Germany invaded Poland, he made the surprise announcement that Field Marshal Hermann Goering, the commander-in-chief of the German Air Force, would be his successor in the case that he died. Hess was relegated to second in line.
Hess took another hit when, always eager to fly, he asked Hitler if he could join the Air Force. Hitler flatly refused and officially revoked Hess's permission to fly at all for as long as the war lasted.
Hess negotiated the ban on his flying down to a single year, but his relationship with the Fuhrer would never recover.
As Hess's status declined with Hitler and the Nazi Party, he began to plan a clandestine peace mission to Britain, perhaps with the hope of reclaiming his stature as Hitler's top man.
It would make sense that Hess thought he could impress Hitler by negotiating peace with Britain. Hitler had made several public attempts, both before and after the invasion of Poland, to create an understanding with Britain. He reasoned that Britain and Germany should be united against the rising Soviet threat, not fighting amongst themselves.
That argument didn't fly with Winston Churchill. Hitler's final appeal to Churchill happened during a July 1940 speech to the German legislature. It was packaged with a threat to invade Britain if they didn't side with Germany.
There was no reply from the British, and Germany's attack on the United Kingdom became an inevitability. But Hess thought he might be the one to secure peace.
Hess needed to find a contact in Britain who had enough influence and an open enough mind to negotiate peace terms that would be acceptable to both Hitler and Winston Churchill. As we mentioned earlier, Albrecht Haushofer was Hess's authority on British affairs, so he asked him for suggestions.
From Albrecht's contacts, Hess finally settled on Douglas Hamilton, the Duke of Hamilton.
And yes, his name and title really did have two Douglases and two Hamiltons.
Albrecht had been friendly with Douglas Hamilton before the war, and like Hess, the Duke of Hamilton was an accomplished pilot. He thought they would have some common ground that would lend itself to negotiation.
Knowing little about the intricacies of British politics, Hess also falsely believed that Hamilton was a member of the party that opposed Winston Churchill.
In September 1940, Albrecht Haushofer sent a letter to the Duke of Hamilton, suggesting he meet with Hess in Lisbon, Portugal. The letter was intercepted by British intelligence and wasn't shown to Hamilton until the following March. No reply was ever received.
Not to be dissuaded, Hess decided to fly to Scotland anyway and pay Hamilton what he thought would be a surprise visit.
Hess visited various factories that were assembling the latest German warplanes. His requests to try out their planes were all denied by the chief test pilots, who knew that endangering the life of Hitler's deputy would be a grave mistake.
Finally, Hess went to his friend Willy Messerschmitt, the aircraft designer who produced the Bf-109, the most prolific German fighter plane during World War II, and the Bf-108, which Hess had performed death-defying stunts in, despite Hitler's interdiction. Hess was in luck. Messerschmitt agreed to have his chief test pilot train him in the Bf-110, which had a second seat that Hess could observe from before taking the controls on his own.
It was probably more than luck that Messerschmitt helped Hess out. In 1932, Hess had stopped the city of Augsburg from seizing Messerschmitt's factory to use as a tramcar depot, so you might say that Messerschmitt owed him one.
The team at Messerschmitt's factory was enamored to have the deputy Fuehrer take such an interest in the aircraft, and they happily complied with his request to make modifications to the plane.
The most important modification was the addition of two 900-liter drop-fuel tanks, which gave the aircraft enough range to reach Dungavel House in Scotland, where the Duke of Hamilton lived. Hess also had the oxygen tanks meant for the back seat rerouted to the pilot's seat, so he would have twice the oxygen supply for his extended solo flight.
This factory, incidentally, would also be the site of Hess's final public appearance. He gave a National Labor Day speech on Hitler's behalf, praising the facility as a model factory just 9 days before his flight.
In preparation for the flight, Hess packed some personal items that give us some insight into his mindset at the time. Most interestingly, a litany of medicines and homeopathic remedies, including a sterilized hypodermic syringe. Hess was a known hypochondriac.
Yet he didn't bring a single change of underwear, which could indicate that he was expecting extremely warm hospitality at Dungavel House.
On the morning of May 10, 1941, Hess spent an unusually large amount of time with his 3.5-year-old son, Wolf, possibly afraid that he might not come back from his journey alive. He took the toddler for a walk along the river Isar and later to the Hellebrunn Zoo. This was the last time Wolf would ever see his father as a free man.
Hess told his wife Ilse that he was just going to Berlin and that he would be back by Monday evening at the latest. He rushed out of their house before she could question him any further.
At 5:45 that evening, Hess lifted off from Augsburg-Haunstetten airfield in his Messerschmitt Bf-100, embarking on the mission that would cement his dismal fate.
After the break, we'll explore Hess's dangerous flight to Scotland, his capture and imprisonment, and the official story of his death in Spandau prison. And now, back to the story.
Before he took off for Scotland on May 10, 1941, Rudolf Hess left a message for Hitler, informing him of his plan to negotiate peace with Britain. Predictably, Hitler was furious. He was afraid that Germany's allies might think Hess had been sent on an official mission to negotiate with Britain behind their backs.
Hess's friends and relatives were rounded up and questioned. Many of them were arrested, although notably his wife Ilse was spared after her initial questioning.
Albrecht Haushofer wasn't so lucky. He was brought to Hitler's home by the secret police and forced to spill everything he knew about Hess and his mission. Afterward, he was detained for 3 months.
Hitler realized it was to Germany's advantage to break the news about the mission before Hess was discovered in Britain. If the public heard it from British sources first, Germany would appear weak.
Hitler authorized an official statement claiming that Hess was mentally ill and had most likely crashed his plane on his way to Great Britain. He also revoked all of Hess's official titles, kicked him out of the Nazi Party, and banished him from Germany, going so far as to order him shot on sight if he ever returned. Needless to say, Hess's close relationship with Hitler was irrevocably destroyed.
Meanwhile, in Scotland, Hess was having some trouble finding the Duke of Hamilton's residence at Dungavel House. He ended up flying by without recognizing it.
Once it got dark, Hess realized he was running out of fuel and decided to bail. He climbed to about 6,000 feet, jumped out of the plane, and parachuted to the ground, about 12 miles from Dungavel House.
The impact from the fall knocked Hess unconscious. When he awoke, a man who lived nearby helped him into his house, gave him some water, and, of course, notified the police. Hess was quickly arrested.
The Duke of Hamilton agreed to see Hess the following day, but contrary to Hess's assumptions, Douglas Hamilton had no sympathy for the Nazi cause, and he was disinclined to understand Hess's perspective.
It's important to note here that one of the conspiracy theories we'll explore in next week's episode claims that it was not Hess at all who flew to Scotland, but an impostor. The Duke of Hamilton would have refuted this theory. One of his key impressions from this encounter was that the prisoner was definitely the actual Rudolf Hess.
The conversation was difficult. Hess spoke fluent English, but he had trouble understanding Douglas Hamilton's accent, so much so that the Duke suggested Hess come back later with an interpreter.
Beyond that, Hess's proposition of peace between Britain and Germany seemed ridiculous to Douglas Hamilton. He reasoned that even if the two countries were to make peace, they would be at war again within 2 years.
Hess requested that Douglas Hamilton ask the king to release him, since he had come to Scotland unarmed and of his own volition. That never happened. As soon as Hess's identity was confirmed by British authorities, he was regarded as a high-value prisoner of war.
Winston Churchill personally ordered that Hess be treated with dignity, so he was kept comfortable but under close supervision. Hess would never see the Duke of Hamilton again, but he did write him a number of letters, none of which were ever delivered.
In one letter dated just 9 days after Hess left Germany, he told Hamilton that he had assured Hitler he would not commit suicide under any circumstances, so if he died, Germany would assume the British had murdered him.
It sounds like he was more than a bit nervous. Must have been starting to register that his mission was a failure.
It sure seems that way. He also could have been trying to convince himself that Germany would still get some value out of his mission if he did commit suicide.
On June 16, 1941, Hess wrote suicide letters to his wife, his son, and Hitler, all of which played up the significance of his death for the German cause. Then he jumped over a staircase railing, but only broke his leg.
It makes sense that a prisoner of war would attempt suicide after failing such an important mission and being captured by the enemy. I wouldn't be surprised if Hess held on to that yearning for meaning in his mission, even after the war had ended.
Patriotism was definitely a theme in Hess's second suicide attempt, too. In 1945, while still a POW, he stabbed himself in the chest with a bread knife, again sustaining only minor injuries. This time, he said it was because it was all over for Germany.
Since Hess had access to the newspaper, The Times, a London-based newspaper, he would have known that Germany was losing the war, and he was unlikely to ever return to his home country. And if he ever did, it would be a far different place from the Nazi Germany he left.
That estrangement from his country was solidified during the 1945 to 1946 Nuremberg trials. Hess was found guilty of crimes against peace and sentenced to life imprisonment at Spandau Allied War Crimes Prison in West Berlin.
7 Nuremberg trial defendants were sentenced to prison time. 3 were given life sentences. Of those 3, Hess would live the longest.
In the early days, conditions at Spandau were harsh. Guards destroyed any creative work the prisoners undertook. The prisoners were not even allowed to speak to one another.
Spandau prisoners were allowed 30 minutes of visitation per month, but Hess never allowed anyone except his lawyer to visit until 1969. Not even his wife Ilse or son Wolf, though he did communicate with his family through letters.
As Hess languished in prison, his last remaining friends died outside its walls. Albrecht Haushofer, who had been his connection to the Duke of Hamilton, was assassinated by the SS in April 1945. His father, Karl Haushofer, the mentor who had first exposed Hess to nationalist ideology, committed suicide the next year. And of course, Hess's hero, Adolf Hitler, committed suicide on April 30th, 1945.
Knowing how much Hess idolized both Hitler and Karl Haushofer, it doesn't seem that far-fetched to assume their suicides could have pushed Hess himself to attempt suicide once again.
If that were the case, he sure took a long time to decide. His next suicide attempt wasn't until 32 years later, in 1977, when the 83-year-old tried to take his own life by cutting his wrists with a knife.
However, there were many other pressures that may have induced Hess to take his own life at that time. He must have been profoundly lonely in Spandau as, one by one, his fellow inmates died or were released. In 1966, Hess became Spandau's lone resident.
Even Winston Churchill thought it was excessive to confine Hess for so long. He believed in the benevolent intentions of Hess's flight to Scotland and felt that the deputy Fuehrer must have suffered from mental illness.
After his third suicide attempt in 1977, Hess was allowed to move freely within his cell block and to have his own daily routine. He had 2 cooks of his own who would prepare whatever meal he wanted. He was provided with newspapers and TV, the heat was adjusted to whatever temperature he liked, and wall-to-wall carpeting was installed in his cell.
The list goes on. He was given a gardening plot, tailored clothing, a record player so he could listen to his beloved classical music, and even a film projector to watch home movies of his grandchildren. Sounds like pretty good living.
For a prisoner, at least. Hess still suffered certain indignities. Aside from the obvious fact that he couldn't leave Spandau, his mail was censored and limited to just 1 letter per week to and from his family. Any other incoming mail was shredded.
Finally, on August 17th, 1987, 46 years after Hess's conviction and over 20 years after Hess's last co-inmates were released, the world media reported that the 93-year-old Rudolf Hess had died.
According to the official report from the Allied powers, which came a week later, Hess committed suicide on August 17th by tying an extension cord around his neck and hanging himself from a window latch. He was rushed to a British military hospital where attempts to revive him failed. He was pronounced dead at 4:10 p.m.
Also, according to the official report, a suicide note addressed to Hess's family was discovered in his pocket, which a British document expert confirmed was written by Hess.
The report further claimed that a full autopsy, supervised by representatives from all 4 Allied powers, confirmed that Hess had died from asphyxia.
But not everyone is buying the official report. Next week, we'll discuss 2 conspiracy theories regarding how and whether Rudolf Hess died in Spandau prison. Conspiracy theory number 1. Rudolf Hess didn't commit suicide. He was murdered by the British government, who who were afraid that Hess held wartime secrets that could seriously humiliate the UK were he ever released.
The UK, France, and United States had long held that they would agree to release Hess if only the Soviets would get on board. With the Soviet Union liberalizing under Gorbachev in the late 80s, it seemed increasingly likely it would happen.
It's not hard to imagine any government, even a democratic one, committing murder to preserve state secrets.
But it's hard to imagine what dangerous international secrets a prisoner who'd been locked up since World War II could have possibly known.
Maybe the British didn't murder Hess in prison at all. According to conspiracy theory number 2, it wasn't Hess who flew to Scotland and served a life sentence in Spandau. It was an impostor. The real Hess was murdered as a free man, either before or after his double was captured.
Why would an impostor spend the rest of his life in prison without ever mentioning his innocence?
Well, it sure is a mystery.
In October 1992, attendees of the 11th Institute for Historical Review Conference in Irvine, California, gathered to watch a video recording of a speech by Wolf Rudiger Hess, son of Rudolf Hess, Adolf Hitler's loyal deputy Fuehrer.
The Institute for Historical Review is an Orange County, California-based organization known for its anti-Semitic views and publication of propaganda materials espousing Holocaust denial.
Until his death in 2001, Wolf remained a vocal proponent of the theory that his father, who was sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg trials after Germany's defeat in World War II, did not commit suicide by hanging in Spandau prison, as official reports claimed. Instead, Wolf insisted Hess was murdered at the age of 93 by the British Secret Intelligence Service.
Wolf closed his speech with the words, quote, "I am convinced that history and justice will absolve my father. His courage in risking his life for peace, the long injustice he endured, and his martyrdom will not be forgotten. He will be vindicated, and his final words at the Nuremberg trial, 'I regret nothing,' will stand forever."
He didn't come to the table empty-handed. Among other things, Wolf had an autopsy report that indicated evidence of forceful strangulation in his father's supposed suicide. We'll be looking at 2 theories about what really happened to Rudolf Hess. Conspiracy theory number 1, which was advocated tirelessly by Hess's son Wolf. What was officially presented as death by suicide was actually a cold-blooded murder.
And conspiracy theory number 2. The man who flew to Scotland, fell into British captivity, received a conviction at the Nuremberg trials, served a life sentence in Spandau prison, and died in 1987 was not Rudolf Hess at all, but an impostor doing all that in Hess's name.
First, let's dig into theory number 1. The basic gist of this theory is that Hess's flight from Bavaria to Scotland was an official peace mission that Hitler not only knew about, but sanctioned. Hess offered the British a generous peace treaty, which the British rejected. Once World War II was over, the British government became concerned about what would happen if the public found out they'd turned down a treaty that would have prevented the war's bloodshed and destruction. So, they locked Hess up for the rest of his life to keep him from spilling the secret.
But in 1987, it was looking like the elderly Hess was about to be released from Spandau to spend his final days in peace. Well, the British government couldn't risk him revealing the truth once he was out from under their watchful eye, so they murdered him, lest the world find out how easily Britain could have ended the war.
This theory relies on a lot of assumptions, and to understand them, we have to understand the person behind these claims, Rudolf's son, Wolf Hess.
As we mentioned in part 1, on the morning of May 10th, 1941, the day Rudolf Hess took off from Augsburg-Hohenstetten airfield on his infamous flight to Scotland, he spent an inordinate amount of time with his 3.5-year-old son, Wolf. His wife Ilse wasn't quite sure why at the time, but she later realized that her husband had been lavishing attention upon their son because he was afraid he might never see him again.
It did indeed turn out to be the last time Hess would see his son for almost 30 years, and the last time he'd see him at all as a free man.
Wolf would, however, receive many letters from his imprisoned father. Hess's letters to both Wolf and Ilse show a keen fatherly interest, ranging from affectionate advice to casual discussions about art, music, sports, science, and technology. Hess wanted to be an involved father, even from the confines of Spandau.
The fact that Rudolf worked so hard to keep the relationship alive may have created an intimacy that could explain why Wolf fought so hard for so many years to get his father out of prison, and later to prove that his death was a murder.
It's certainly possible that Wolf was driven more by emotions than he was by facts. But before we start to imply that Wolf was just a loyal son trying to help his old man retire in freedom, it's important to point out that he was, well, a Nazi.
In the 1992 video address to the Institute for Historical Review conference, Wolf expressed deep sympathies for Hitler and his cause. He also spoke highly of Mein Kampf, describing it as a seminal work, and complained that his father, in 1919, after returning from hard combat in World War I, had to witness a Bavaria run by communists and Jews.
Wolf Hess also spoke about World War II as a patriotic struggle only made necessary by British irrationality, justifying every move of German aggression as a reluctant last resort. After all, Hitler's benevolent offers for peace were arrogantly rejected. And even though he spoke at length about the politics and logistics of the war, he never mentioned the persecution of Jews, the SS, concentration camps, or the Holocaust.
I feel like we should also point out that the fact that Wolf Hess harbored Nazi sympathies doesn't prove that his theory about his father's death, or anything else he says for that matter, is wrong. We really want to avoid using a logical fallacy known as poisoning the well, where unflattering information is presented about a person in order to discredit anything they say.
Absolutely. It would also be illogical to assume that Wolf promoted his theory just because his political cause would have something to gain if people believe it. In fact, that would be a circumstantial ad hominem argument. A claim that someone's assumed benefit from winning an argument proves that their position is wrong.
But even though none of this conclusively proves anything, it is part of the complete picture and worth considering.
Speaking of the complete picture, Wolf definitely did not believe that the official story contained it. Well, for one thing, he took issue with the idea that his father's flight to Scotland was his own secret brainchild. He believed that not only did Hitler know about the flight in advance, but it was an officially sanctioned peace mission. And since it was an officially sanctioned peace mission, the British eventually had to murder Hess to conceal that they had imprisoned a benevolent diplomat who had presented them with an opportunity to end the war and prevent immeasurable strife.
Wolf gave 5 justifications for believing that Hess's peace mission was official. First, he claimed that a few days before the flight, his father met privately with Hitler for 4 hours. The two of them raised their voices for parts of the meeting, and when they came out, Hitler put his arm around Rudolf Hess's shoulder and said, quote, "Hess, you really are stubborn," end quote. Wolf didn't mention how he knew about this meeting or where it took place.
I consider myself pretty open-minded, but that's a tough one to take seriously since he doesn't even know what they talked about in the meeting. Wolf himself was only 3 years old, so I doubt he would have understood what was going on.
His second justification is the notion that Hess and Hitler's relationship was so strong and intimate that, quote, "One can logically assume that Hess would not have undertaken such an important step in the middle of a war without first informing Hitler," end quote.
If we bought that one, we'd have to take for granted that their relationship was still close. And that's hard to believe, considering that Hitler had recently banned Hess from flying and relegated him to third in line for succession. And even if they were close, can a person not go behind the back of someone they're close to?
It does seem like quite a stretch. Here's the third justification. Wolf admits that Hess's adjutants and secretaries were rounded up and incarcerated after the flight, but he doesn't think Hitler would have done two specific things if Hess had disobeyed him: made sure Ilse got a pension and sent a condolences telegram to Rudolf Hess's mother when his father died 6 months after the flight. We couldn't find any neutral sources to verify either the pension or the telegram, though that doesn't prove they didn't happen.
Hitler is pretty well established as a vengeful maniac. If Hitler really did send the pension and the telegram, it does seem odd that he would do something so nice for the family of a guy who stabbed him in the back.
Here's the fourth one. We mentioned in part 1 that Hess wrote 3 letters right before his first suicide attempt in 1941. One to his family, one to Wolf, and one to Hitler, trying to attach some sort of significance to his failed peace mission. Well, according to Wolf, 2 of those letters prove that Hess and Hitler still had a trusting relationship, and by extension, that Hess couldn't, or at least in all likelihood wouldn't, have flown to Scotland without Hitler's knowledge.
The letter to Hitler has a lot of praise, bordering on worship, really. He told Hitler that for the last 2 decades, the Fuehrer had fulfilled his life and made it worth living again, that he'd been reborn for Hitler, that he salutes their greater Germany through Hitler, that kind of thing.
Sounds more like sucking up than intimacy.
Agreed. However, he did also say that he commends his relatives, including his aging parents, to Hitler's care.
That's something a close friend might say, and it could explain why Ilse got the pension and Hess's mother got the condolences.
Well, the other letter, the one to Ilse, promises that, quote, "For you and Buzz and my parents, the Fuehrer will provide."
I wouldn't accept this as incontrovertible proof, but it does add some weight to his argument.
Finally, the 5th reason Wolf thought Hitler knew about the flight, because Ernst Wilhelm Bülow thought so. I should clarify. Bülow was the leader of the Nazi Party's foreign organization, which kept tabs on party members living abroad. He worked under Hess and was considered a confidant. Wolf didn't say why he thought Bülow would know this, at least not in any of our sources.
I don't think we have enough information to give weight to that one either way.
I won't argue with that. So maybe Hitler knew about Hess's flight, maybe not, but Hitler's presumed knowledge of the 1941 peace mission flight is crucial to Wolf's conspiracy theory.
Wolf claimed that during his father's entire 40-plus years as a prisoner, a gag order prevented Hess from saying anything openly about his peace mission.
Wolf reasoned that this restriction was imposed because Hess held secrets that would seriously embarrass the British, and possibly US and Soviet governments, if they leaked to the public. The secrets at stake were the exact content of Hess's peace proposals, which Wolf thought were so blatantly reasonable that the Allies, and Britain in particular, would seem cruel and warlike for rejecting them.
Although there are no documents to prove this, Wolf maintained that Hess's conversation with the Duke of Hamilton involved an elaborate list of peace proposals that included generous concessions to Britain. He claimed Germany offered Britain continued hegemony at sea and continued influence over certain parts of the Mediterranean, Middle East, and Africa.
But it wasn't all olive branches. The alleged peace proposals also requested free rein for Germany over continental Europe without British interference, including total disarmament of France.
Not a small request.
No, nevertheless, Wolf maintained that if Britain would have accepted these terms, Hitler never would have attacked Russia, and the war would have, quote, withered away on all fronts.
He blames Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt for unimaginable death and suffering by rejecting the, quote, outstretched hand of peace.
Let's assume for the moment that Hess presented all these offers to the British, that they were rejected, and that the British were so wary of letting the details leak that they kept Hess shushed for the rest of his life. It's still worth discussing why they waited until 1987 to murder him.
Absolutely. As we explored in Part 1, conditions in Spandau started out extremely harsh in the period immediately following World War II. Hess's communication with the outside world was heavily censored.
He wasn't allowed any visitors until 1952, and even then, only one visitor a month for 30 minutes until the early 70s, when the limit increased to an hour. He wasn't allowed to read any books that mentioned the Nazi period of German history or the Nuremberg trials.
But over time, as the outside world changed, so did conditions inside Spandau. Although the censorship never went away, public pressure led to better treatment for Hess, especially after 1966, when Albert Speer and Baldur von Schirach were released and Hess became Spandau's sole occupant. A lot of people considered his imprisonment inhumane and called for his release. Eventually, it was pretty much universally understood that Britain, France, and the United States were in favor of releasing Hess, but that the Soviets were using their veto power to keep him inside.
With an estimated 20 to 27 million war-related deaths, the Soviet Union had suffered more than anyone else from Nazi aggression. Showing mercy toward a guy who had played such a big role in that conflict was understandably not high on Moscow's priority list.
But as the Soviet Union liberalized under Mikhail Gorbachev and began to shed its reputation for strictness and cruelty, Wolf Hess saw an opportunity. He sent a letter to the Soviet consulate in Bonn and met with the embassy counselor on March 31st, 1987, incidentally on the same day as his last visit with his father. The counselor allegedly revealed that an influential faction inside the USSR supported Hess's release, including Gorbachev himself.
Well, there is external evidence to back this claim up. On April 13, 1987, the German news magazine Der Spiegel reported that Gorbachev had adopted the view that releasing Hess would be, quote, accepted worldwide as a gesture of humanity. Wolf thought that this possibility made the British and Americans scramble. They'd been bluffing about wanting to release Hess all along, trying to maintain the illusion of humanitarianism while relying on the Soviets to keep Hess and his secrets locked away.
Unfortunately, Wolf's efforts were too little, too late. On Monday, August 17, 1987, at 6:35 p.m., Wolf received a call informing him that his father had died. Spandau's American director told him, quote, I am authorized to inform you that your father expired today at 4:10 p.m. I am not authorized to give you any further details, end quote.
When we come back, we'll examine Wolf's interpretation of the evidence, then dive into the provocative claims of conspiracy theory number 2, that the man murdered in Spandau was actually just a Rudolf Hess impersonator. The British government might have had a motive to murder Rudolf Hess in 1986, but our conspiracy theories don't stop there. Hess's son Wolf also took issue with the official report and autopsy, a sentiment he shared with Hugh Thomas, the main proponent of conspiracy theory number 2.
Although both Wolf and Thomas believed that the man who died in Spandau on August 17, 1987, was murdered by the British, they differed on a key point. Wolf maintained until his own death in 2001 that the prisoner was actually his father. Thomas, however, wrote and published a 195-page book arguing that the prisoner was a mere look-alike. We'll discuss that theory a little later, but first, let's explore 3 reasons both Wolf Hess and Hugh Thomas believed the prisoner, whoever he was murdered.
We'll start with the first reason. The prisoner was supposedly too weak to hang himself. The initial official report from the Allies claimed that in the afternoon of August 17, 1987, Hess, in accordance with his routine, went into a summer house in the prison garden. A few minutes later, a guard looked inside and found Hess with an electrical cord tied around his neck. Prison staff tried unsuccessfully to resuscitate him, eventually taking him to the British military hospital, where staffers also failed to revive him. He was declared dead at 4:10 p.m.
The report also claimed that it seemed like a suicide attempt, but that a thorough investigation, including an autopsy, was forthcoming. The second report came a month later, confirming suicide as the cause of death. It alleged that Hess had hanged himself from a window latch with a suicide note addressed to his family in his pocket. The official autopsy, performed by the British physician Dr. Malcolm Cameron and supervised by medical representatives from the Four Powers, claimed to find a mark on the side of Hess's neck consistent with a ligature, and that the likely cause of death was asphyxia by suspension.
Wolf and Thomas didn't buy it. According to Wolf, his 93-year-old father had no strength in his hands and struggled to even move from his cell to the garden. Wolf couldn't imagine how Hess could have pulled off a suicide by hanging.
Thomas concurred with Wolf on that point. We mentioned that Thomas was a physician who briefly provided medical care to Hess, well, prisoner number 7, as he called the alleged impostor in his book. The book characterizes the elderly prisoner as weak, uncertain of his gait, limited in his vision, unbalanced, and poorly postured. It also vividly describes the prisoner's spinal stoop and difficulties turning his head, claiming that in 1984, it had become so dangerous for him to stand up that prison authorities lowered his washroom mirror to waist height. According to Thomas, prisoner number 7, quote, could not possibly have committed suicide in the way which has been suggested, end quote.
I'm keeping an open mind. If Hess, or whoever the prisoner was 93 years old and feeble, it doesn't seem that far-fetched to claim that suicide by hanging might have been beyond his abilities.
Fair enough. Let's move on to reason number 2, that Wolf and Thomas both believe the prisoner was murdered. The testimony of a medical orderly named Abdallah Malawi. Malawi was a Tunisian civilian working at Spandau when the prisoner died. Wolf believed this was significant. He claimed that because Malawi was non-military and not a citizen of any of the 4 Allied powers running the prison, he couldn't be silenced or exiled, and therefore his testimony was credible.
Can a government really not silence someone who isn't a citizen? That sounds like a big assumption.
I can't make sense of it either. In Wolf's telling, Malawi contacted his family after the death and told them that when he arrived at the scene after being delayed by guards, he saw Hess lying lifeless on the ground while an American guard stood nearby looking frazzled. The furniture had been thrown around as though there'd been a struggle, and there were 2 calm strangers in U.S. military uniforms, which he thought was unusual since no soldiers were allowed in the area.
Malawi actually went on the BBC Two program Newsnight in 1989 to tell this story. He also corroborated Wolf's and Thomas's claims that the prisoner was too sick to hang himself.
Colonel Tony Letizier, the British governor of Spandau prison, responded to Malawi's claims by saying that the delay in his arrival was not because the guards delayed him on purpose, but because they had so much trouble finding Malawi, and that even the record of his sign-in shows that there wasn't really much of a delay between the death and Malawi's arrival anyway. Letizier explained the American strangers in military uniforms by saying they weren't soldiers, but medics who had been called to help resuscitate Hess, and even did so while Malawi was there. The furniture had been pushed out of the way during their earlier resuscitation attempts.
That makes sense to me. While we're on the subject, another notable Newsnight guest related to the Hess case was a University of Munich professor named Dr. Wolfgang Spahn, who performed a second autopsy on the body. In the late 80s, he went on the show to discuss his findings.
He claimed that the marks on the body did not resemble those typical of a hanging. Both Wolf and Thomas pointed to Spahn's autopsy as evidence that the prisoner had been murdered. Colonel Letizier took issue with that second autopsy. He reasoned that the marks didn't look like typical hanging marks because it wasn't a typical hanging. Instead of suspending himself from the ceiling with his feet above the floor, the prisoner had tied the cord to a window latch and slumped onto the floor with his feet in front of him. And again, not to rely on ad hominem evidence for a final conclusion, but Spahn did perform his autopsy at the request of the Hess family. We have to consider the possibility that his results were influenced by the Hess family's agenda.
Wolf had a couple other reasons for believing the prisoner was murdered that Thomas didn't get into. We'll go over them quickly before we get into Thomas's impostor theory. Well, the first is probably the thing I find most convincing about the murder theory and has to do with the very short alleged suicide note.
Here's the note in its entirety. Quote, "Please, would the governor send this home? Written a few minutes before my death. I thank you all, my beloved, for all the dear things you have done for me. Tell Freiberg I am extremely sorry that since the Nuremberg trial I had to act as though I didn't know her. I had no choice, because otherwise all attempts to gain freedom would have been in vain. I had so looked forward to seeing her again. I did get pictures of her, as of you all. Your eldest."
According to Wolf, his father hadn't referred to himself as your eldest in 20 years. The note is also mainly about Freiberg, Hess's former private secretary. Wolf argued that his father was concerned about reconciling with Freiberg in 1969, when he was close to dying from a perforated ulcer, but that in 1987 there was no reason for him to say any of that.
Wolf also claimed that Hess had a very precise way of expressing himself, and that if he had truly intended to commit suicide, the note would have said so outright, instead of simply using the term "my death." And finally, the note was missing a date, which Wolf alleged wasn't like his father, who had dated every written communication without fail for over 40 years.
For these reasons, Wolf concluded that the note was a forgery, based on a 20-year-old unsent letter that Hess had written when he thought he was about to die from a perforated ulcer.
I have to say, that one is pretty hard to argue with. The note seems so terse for a man's final words to his family, especially a man who had written so affectionately to his family in the past.
My thoughts exactly. Wolf had one more argument. He claimed to know a South African lawyer who had connections to, quote, Western Secret Services. This lawyer gave Wolf's wife an affidavit that spelled out the whole story. Secret agents, intricate break-in, elaborate cover-up, the whole deal.
Who was this South African lawyer?
Anonymous, obviously.
I see. It would be intellectually dishonest to take that seriously. Maybe fun reading for someone who's already inclined to believe Wolf, but definitely not empirical evidence by any stretch.
Well, we've dug pretty deep into conspiracy theory number one. Well, Molly, do you think Wolf was right that his father was murdered by the British in Spandau prison?
I'd have to give that theory a 2 out of 10. I just can't imagine that the British government would murder an old man to keep a lid on those unimpressive peace terms. I don't think the public would ever fault Churchill or anyone else for rejecting anything that involved letting Hitler stay in power. That just seems like delusional thinking from a guy who doesn't get how repulsive Nazism seems to most people.
I completely agree. I can't go any higher than a 2 out of 10 on this one either, though I don't think Wolf was intentionally lying. If he made up the entire murder theory as a stunt to save his father's legacy, I think he would have built a case that didn't rely so heavily on Nazi sympathies.
Wolf campaigned relentlessly for his father's freedom, but he never wavered in the belief that the prisoner at Spandau was indeed Rudolf Hess. Hugh Thomas, not so much.
When we come back, we'll delve into Hugh Thomas's story and why this accomplished surgeon is absolutely certain that the prisoner who died in Spandau in 1987 was not Rudolf Hess.
And now, back to our story. In 1979, British Army surgeon Hugh Thomas published a book introducing the world to our second conspiracy theory. The man claiming to be Rudolf Hess was actually an impostor. His plane was shot down by German forces before he made it to Scotland, and he was replaced by a perfect look-alike who successfully impersonated him for decades.
Thomas, like Wolf Hess, holds that the impostor was murdered in 1987 to prevent him from revealing damaging secrets about the British government.
There's a lot to unpack here. First of all, Wolf Hess had been visiting the prisoner who claimed to be Hess and corresponding with him through letters for years. If there's anything we should be able to take on faith, it's the ability of a son to recognize his own father.
No, but don't forget, Wolf was only 3 years old when Hess disappeared from his life, and they supposedly didn't see each other again until he was 32. At that point, you're basically meeting a stranger. And even so, the main components of Hugh Thomas's impostor argument have nothing to do with Hess's correspondences with Wolf. Instead, he built his case on two principal observations. First, details about the plane Hess allegedly flew to Scotland, and second, the time he saw the prisoner's naked body as a medical consultant. Let's dig in.
Thomas's argument hinges on the assertion that the plane that took off from Augsburg-Hounstetten airfield on May 10, 1941, and the one that crash-landed in Scotland late that night were actually two different planes. From this, he concludes that the real Hess was shot down somewhere along the way, and a look-alike, who is also an accomplished pilot, took off from another airfield and completed the trip.
Thomas admitted that he couldn't figure out exactly who ordered Hess shot down or why, but in what he referred to as, quote, my guess, he suggested that it was Heinrich Himmler, head of the SS.
Thomas believed Himmler was trying to usurp Hitler as Fuehrer and saw the loyal and high-ranking Hess as an obstacle. When Himmler found out about Hess's secret peacemaking mission, he didn't want to risk Hess coming home a beloved hero. So, he arranged for Hess's plane to be shot down over the North Sea and replaced by a similar plane flown by a Hess look-alike who would sabotage the mission and ruin Hess's reputation for good.
As for the plane itself, Thomas wrote that the plane Hess took off in was a Messerschmitt Bf-110 with a radio code marking NJ plus C11. However, from photos of the wreckage, the plane that crash-landed in Scotland was clearly marked VJ plus OQ. Furthermore, there's no record of the code NJ plus C11 ever being issued in Germany.
The main person historians have relied upon in determining the code on Hess's plane is a test pilot named Helmut Kaden, who accompanied Hess on some of his training flights and was responsible for preparing the plane. Kaden has made some of Hess's test flight records available, though others were destroyed in American bombing raids. He reported that the plane Hess took off in was marked VJ plus OQ, just like the one that crash-landed in Scotland.
Kaden also claimed that when Hess flew VJ plus OQ for the first time, he told him that he liked it a lot and requested that it be set aside for his personal use. According to Kaden's story, which also became the official story, Hess never flew another plane after choosing VJ plus OQ. Thomas, of course, took issue with that, asserting that Kaden's diary recorded the code of the plane Hess took off in as NJ plus C11. He accused Kaden of changing his story only after finding out that the markings on the crash plane were different.
If Thomas was just trying to prove that the planes were different, it would have been enough to dispute the code on just a takeoff plane. That's why it's really strange that he also disputed the code on the crashed plane. He claimed that although it was originally VJ plus OQ, like the official story says, it had been changed to NJ plus OQ by adding a brushstroke to the V to make it look like an N.
Well, he argues that this was common practice. When the fighters were produced, they were marked with a VJ code, but if they were delivered to a night fighter squadron, the V was changed to an N.
A night fighter was just what it sounds like, a plane that had some special modifications for nighttime or low visibility flying. However, Roy Conyers-Nesbitt and George Van Acker, co-authors of a book that seeks to debunk conspiracy theories about Hess, claim that night fighter squadrons actually never used NJ codes. Based on more thorough research, this checks out.
We figured this would be an easy question to clear up, so we took a look at the photos of the remains and wreckage site. It seems very clear to us that the code is indeed VJOQ, so we're not sure how Thomas got the idea that the first letter was N.
If you're wondering what the VN dispute has to do with Thomas's impostor theory, so are we. He never gave any reason for the alleged change in the plane's code, except to cast doubt on the trustworthiness of the official sources. Ironically, in my mind, the whole manufactured controversy just undermines Thomas's own credibility.
Thomas also had some things to say about the capabilities of the Messerschmitt 110 plane. However many were involved, he held that the 110 didn't have enough range to get from Bavaria to Scotland in a single flight, even with the biggest possible drop tanks installed on the wings. His figures calculated the plane's fuel capacity at 2,800 liters, with a maximum range of 1,932 kilometers. He pegged the flight distance at 2,093 kilometers.
However, the official specs for the plane disagree. With the appropriate modifications, it could hold 3,070 liters of fuel, not just 2,800, giving it a range of 2,000 kilometers. An official Luftwaffe calculation of Hess's flight calculated his total distance at 1,953 kilometers and his total fuel consumption at 2,950 liters, even factoring in activities that consume extra fuel, such as rapid climbing. According to these figures, it would have been entirely possible for Hess to get from Augsburg-Houndstetten to Scotland without refueling, let alone being shot down and replaced by an imposter pilot.
It's hard to take issue with official specs, since the plane Hess used was mass-produced, and the specs should be undisputed general knowledge. Now, the official Luftwaffe calculation of Hess's flight, though, I could see that being embellished to protect the official story.
Maybe. If it was an imposter who flew to Scotland, Germany definitely wouldn't have wanted anyone to know.
Let's talk about the area where Thomas might have some real authority, the medical stuff.
As we mentioned earlier, Thomas was a former army surgeon who tended to the prisoner known as Rudolf Hess as a surgical consultant in 1973. He describes the whole encounter in intense detail in his book, but we'll give you an abridged version.
In 1973, after some Soviet resistance, the four powers decided it was time to take the 79-year-old prisoner to a hospital for some x-rays to see if anything worrisome was going on inside his body. Although he wasn't exhibiting any particular symptoms, his medical care inside Spandau had been dismal up to that point, and the commander of the British military hospital recommended taking the precaution. The transfer was a big deal, involving a motorcade and armed soldiers keeping the throngs of citizens and press at bay.
The examination itself was attended not only by the necessary doctors, but by a multitude of other people, members of the hospital staff, commanders from other Allied hospitals, Spandau officials, and British soldiers. In Thomas's telling, what was supposed to be a medical event turned into a social occasion, with most of the people there coming just for the sake of seeing the last Nazi criminal at Spandau. Thomas mentions a lavish lunch table with alcohol and salmon sandwiches. Thomas claimed he didn't drink while on duty, but that the sandwiches were excellent.
The scene sounds ridiculous, but the most ridiculous thing about it, according to Thomas, was Voitev, Spandau's ranking Russian. Anytime someone would show the prisoner a little bit of human kindness, Voitev would scream in Russian, "Stop! That is contrary to the Nuremberg Agreement," or "No comfort, it is against the spirit of the convention."
As a staffer at the hospital, Thomas was there for the hours of various tests performed on the prisoner, but he wasn't directly assigned to perform any of them. Still, he had studied up on Hess's medical history, including his World War I wound record, and was eager for the chance to look at him.
A quick aside on that wound record, it shows a pea-sized wound where a bullet entered his chest, with an exit wound in his back the size of a cherry pit. It happened in Romania on July 23, 1917. There were others, but that was the big one. The bullet damaged his lung.
Okay, back to the hospital. There was no way Thomas could approach the prisoner closely enough with Voitev in the room. But at the same moment the exam was ending and the prisoner was taking off his hospital gown, Wojtek happened to leave the room.
Seizing the moment, Thomas moved close to the prisoner and looked over his naked body for a few seconds. In a moment of what he describes as bewilderment, Thomas ascertained that the prisoner had no scars from any of the wounds reported on Hess's war record. Then, under the pretense of helping, he offered to take the prisoner's gown, buying him a few more seconds to stare at his naked body, again finding no evidence of the purported wounds. He spent the rest of the evening stunned.
The doctors decided a few days later that the x-rays had missed a spot, so the prisoner was brought back to the hospital. Thomas claimed that in contrast to the first visit, this time the patient was cheerful and smiley, taking an interest in what was happening and making pleasant small talk in English. Until, that is, Thomas casually asked him what happened to his war wounds.
I'll just quote Thomas's book here. The question had a startling effect. The patient's manner changed instantly. From being in a sunny, cheerful mood, he turned chalk white and began to shake. For an instant he stared at me in what appeared bewilderment or even utter disbelief. Then he looked down and avoided my eyes. After what felt like ages, he muttered, "Zu spät, zu spät." Too late, too late.
And I'll paraphrase the next part. The patient stood up and made his way toward the changing room, leaving behind him a torrent of diarrhea.
Is that what happens when someone exposes your biggest secret?
I hope I never find out. The prisoner avoided Thomas for the rest of the visit. From that moment on, Thomas became absolutely certain that the man who flew to Scotland, stood trial at Nuremberg, served a life sentence in Spandau, and died in captivity on August 17, 1987, was not Rudolf Hess, but an impostor sent in his stead.
It's beyond the scope of this podcast to get into the minutiae of Thomas's arguments about the nature of bullet wounds and scars. He goes into painstaking detail that's hard to question if you don't have medical training. But one significant point he made that's worth mentioning is that scars never disappear. They fade over time, but they never go away completely. He reasoned that if the prisoner had genuinely been Hess, he would have seen some evidence of the scars of some kind, but he couldn't find any at all during his quick, unauthorized examination.
For their book, Nesbitt and Van Acker, the authors who tried to debunk Hugh's theory, consulted a forensic pathologist named Bernard Knight to ask if it was possible that these scars could have become invisible to the naked eye. I'll paraphrase Knight's answer, quote, "Not likely, but sure, especially if you don't know where to look," end quote.
There was also a French pastor in Spandau named Charles Gabel, who wrote a book about his conversations with the prisoner. According to Gabel, when Thomas's book came out and he told the prisoner about it, Hess, quote, laughed heartily and told me that 2 British doctors, the director of the military hospital and a surgeon, had visited him to look at these famous scars, which they found, although they were not very visible.
I suppose there's a chance the prisoner could have lied to Gabel about the scars, as you would expect an impostor to. But there's also a good chance Hess's scars actually had faded over the decades, to the point where Thomas couldn't see them from a few feet away.
There is one more piece of evidence we need to discuss. As a result of Thomas's conspiracy mongering, forensic scientists from the University of Salzburg in Austria dug up an old blood sample from the prisoner and performed a DNA test, comparing it to a living Hess relative. The results, which were published on January 22, 2019, confirmed that there was a 99.99% chance the prisoner was indeed Rudolf Hess.
That's the nail in the coffin for me. But based on everything we know, what do you think of conspiracy theory number 2? Was the man who died in Spandau an impostor?
I have to say 1 out of 10. Thomas's entire theory is based on a few seconds of looking at the prisoner's body for scars. That doesn't exactly hold up against DNA evidence.
Another glaring thing about the theory that really sticks out to me is the motivations of the impostor himself. Why would anyone throw their life away in prison for almost half a century and never mention anything to anyone about it?
That is a smart question that deserves a good answer, and Thomas never gave one.
Both of these conspiracy theories may be far-fetched, but I have to give at least a little respect to anyone with a fervent commitment to finding the truth, even if their version of it doesn't agree with the facts.
Indeed. However, in this case, we believe the official story is most likely the truth. Rudolf Hess was captured as a prisoner of war while on a rogue peace mission and sentenced to life imprisonment at the Nuremberg trials. And on August 17, 1987, at the age of 93, he took his own life.
It's understandable that Hess's son would be reluctant to accept such a lonely end to his father's long and lonely life. But given Hess's history of suicide attempts, the official story of his death isn't surprising. After his lifetime of well-deserved punishment, I think it's finally time to let the last Nazi war criminal rest in silence, if not in peace.